Greetings. This is a beginning of a series where I'll build and paint up every single warband that took part in the Siege of Vraks, and I will be starting with the ones who started it all, the Faithless. Lore for the Siege was written way before modern style for Chaos Space Marines was established, so to match that old-school feel and the reference art, I've printed up a helmet and a body. Rest of the parts came from Legionnaire's kit. I specifically chose this bolter for that sneaky tactical feel, and I've assembled all the parts together with poster putty. This allowed me to see if the pose even looked good at all. And yeah, I like it, especially those double mags taped together. That's class. Now, when it comes to painting, I want to do a classic Alpha Legion metallic greenish blue. I'm going to take a small creative liberty and omit these weird pentagons that are featured on one single piece of art for this warband. I just don't like them. For priming, I use black primer from MRP. Once dry, it leaves nice, glossy surface that will be optimal for the next step. That being natural steel color from AK. This was applied in multiple thin coats in order to achieve smooth finish. And also because I've added too much thinner, but in the end, I've got this beautiful steel, although it's a bit too dark for my liking. I've fixed that with a heavy dry brushing of silver. This not only made the color brighter, but also highlighted all the edges. Nice. And now for the main event, Akhelian green contrast paint. This one is ridiculously heavily pigmented, so I had to thin it a lot. At some point I lost count of how much thinner I added, because I had to add so much of it, and it still covered nicely in barely 2 passes. This was my first time using contrast through airbrush, and I'm really stoked with the results. The camera doesn't show the subtle green undertone of this color, but still, this turned out great. Now we can put away the airbrush and start base coating all the small bits by hand. I've started with gray for the undersuit, and while I had the gray out, I've painted all the bony bits. I do this to make painting them ivory later easier, although in this case it was probably unnecessary. Next up, Death Reaper for the gun casing and the cable on the helmet, and Cuirass leather for the belt and tabard. I don't know if I like this, kinda doesn't fit. Whatever, I'll deal with that later. When painting the trim, I had to be very careful because there's no good way for me to touch up mistakes. So going slow and steady was the key here. Thankfully, this paint covers really good, and 2 coats was all it took. I didn't get much footage of this, because I didn't want to mess up. But I've used the same color for the working metallic parts as well. Few more decorative parts, such as trim on the bolter, were picked out with brass. I say that as if the whole trim wasn't purely for looks. I'll guess it serves some identification purpose. Besides, it looks sick as hell, so who cares? And now we're going to finish up base coating with ivory tusk, applied over all the bony bits. And with that out of the way, I've washed everything besides blue armor black. And here I gotta say, as much as I love Duncan's paints, Citadel washes are just better. Nuln oil has that little something to it that makes it work for me so nicely. I apply this straight from the bottle in small amounts, but I make sure my brush has plenty of water, not like soaking wet, but decently damp. This way I don't have to put it out on my palette to get it thinned. Once that dried, No, I can't. Gimme a second. Wow, and suddenly I don't hate it anymore. With that eyesore gone, we can finally focus on edge highlighting. I've started with cloth and the gun casing. Both were highlighted with Carcharodon's gray. And then I've re-established ivory on the raised details of bones while taking care to avoid recesses that were darkened by the wash. Lastly, for highlights, I've tackled the trim, again, very carefully. By using the edge of the brush, I can make effortless, sharp lines. I mean, it's in the name, use edges for edge highlights. But for places where you just have to use the point of the brush, steady hand and slow speed is the way. Back to the Nuln oil. Instead of covering the whole mini with this stuff, I decided to put it only in the recesses, basically panel lining. And this definitely will be my way of applying washes going forward. I don't know why I haven't came up with this earlier. Before getting into Warhammer, I was doing the exact same thing on armor models, but with enamels. I may have some sort of brain damage or something. Anyway, it's time to wrap up this paint job with eyes. First, eye sockets were painted with white and given a thin coat of black wash. Next up, I've mixed Blood Angel's red with small amount of Magmadroth flame. This was applied in generous amount, and then the excess was removed from the middle with a brush.
The path to ruin!
Before the final assembly, I've sprayed a tiny amount of gloss varnish where I'll place a transfer. And then I've used Tamiya Mark Fit Strong. This was applied several times, letting it fully dry before each coat. Afterwards, I sprayed some matte to hide the clear film of the decal and to dull down the glossiness. Now, for the first time on my channel, I'm actually going to show you painting a base, because for this series, we're going for a unified basing scheme. For dirt, I've used AK dry ground texture paste, and I left spots for our marine's feet to stand on. While it was still wet, I've pressed the barbed wire into it and left it overnight to dry. Ground was painted with Eidolon gray and dry brushed with the same color, but mixed with some white. Two thin coats paints have satin finish. While I do like it for miniatures, it doesn't really work for dry ground. So I've sprayed it with matte varnish and then painted the barbed wire with gunmetal. Last steps were giving the wires light wash with reddish brown to give it that slight rusty appearance and painting the rim with black. And with that, I've pinned the mini to the base and called it done.